Our first speaker of this afternoon is Walter Liedtke, who needs very little introduction to many of you. He has been the curator of Dutch and Flemish paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art since 1980 and has published catalogs on those parts of the collection that he has, that is the Dutch and Flemish paintings. But now he is also completing an online catalog of the Spanish paintings and a related publication for them. Walter's hobby, as he calls it, his words, of Spanish art began with his coordination of the Zurbarán exhibition at the Met in 1987, so it has a pretty long history. And it continued with articles on Zurbarán's great Retablo de Jerez de Frontera and on Velázquez's contribution to equestrian portraiture. Walter organized the El Greco in New York exhibition, which remains on view at the Met until this coming Sunday. I think you probably have all seen it anyway. And he reminds me that he goes to Spain at least twice a year to enjoy the following in this order, his order: exhibitions, Spanish friends, the wine, the food, and the landscape. And now we will enjoy the fruits of Walter's hobby as he speaks to us about El Greco in the Metropolitan Museum from 1905 to the present. Please give a warm welcome to Walter Liedtke.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. It takes a certain bravery to turn out. And my lecture today will, of course, differ from a written version of this talk. In a half hour, I think I can really only remind you of the paintings in question at the Metropolitan and to give you an idea of how they came to the Met and what the issues are. There are 10 El Grecos in the Metropolitan Museum, if you count 2 workshop pictures, out of about 50 Spanish paintings ranging in the period from El Greco to Goya. One of the reasons that I can deal with these works as a relatively newcoming scholar to the field is that these pictures are basically either masterpieces or rather minor works, in some cases mistakes. And obviously, if I tried to dabble in the Spanish paintings at, say, the Prado, I might need to be familiar with 10 or 12 alternatives to Velázquez, etc. Well, thanks to people like the Havemeyers, we don't really have that kind of problem in the Met. We have great peaks and a bit of valleys and not a lot of topography in the middle. There are also 40 pre-El Greco paintings, late medieval, Renaissance. Some of them, about a dozen, are frescoes at the cloisters, but mostly they are medieval and early Renaissance panel paintings. And I think really, for the sake of this symposium, we could say they were collected as late medieval and Renaissance panel paintings from Europe, more or less in the same breath that German and early Netherlandish works were acquired without specifically fussing too much that they were Spanish, let alone Aragon or Valencia or whatever. And then we have post-Goya, we have about 17 19th century paintings, and you're looking at one of them, actually early 20th century in my department, which were really collected by collectors who were contemporary with the artist, and these were bought as modern and fashionable pictures. We have, for example, 4 Soroyas, and this is one of the less familiar of them, the Castle of San Servando, to the upper left. That's actually the title we give it, but it seems a little peripheral to the grotto that Sorolla has focused on in this canvas of 1906, which is not presently on view. And I think since one of the paintings, Dutch paintings, in my office is about to disappear for an exhibition, I might just put this up in my office, so you can ring me up if you want to see it. The most interesting thing from the point of view of provenance is that Archer Huntington gave this canvas to the Met in 1922. It was one of the many exhibitions. I forget the number. Marcus, how many works in the... Where are you, Marcus? How many Soroyas were in the 1909 Soroya exhibition? It was a colossal number, wasn't it? Over 300, yeah. A lot of little ones, of which 15, I think, were somehow related to topography, city views, and so on, which struck me because, of course, the Havemeyers, Mrs. Havemeyer, bought the view of Toledo in 1909, the year of that exhibition. But I haven't checked the question of which month that might be. Now, I pick up either of these remote controls. Is that true? Number 2, now you tell me. Okay. I was told you were going to hand it to me. Okay, good. There we are. View of Toledo dating from about 306 years earlier with, to the left, the same castle in it. When it comes to El Greco, or any Spanish painter from El Greco to Goya, we might ask the following questions concerning the Metropolitan Museum or any major art museum in America apart from those specifically devoted to Spanish art, such as the Hispanic Society or, of course, the Meadows Museum in Dallas. And these are the questions. They're rather simple, but there's something to think about. Was the painting purchased by the museum? And if so, was it bought because it represented the art of Spain, or because it was more broadly an old master painting, probably by a significant name such as Velázquez, El Greco, etc.? There are only 3 of the Met's 10 El Grecos that were purchases. In the more common case of a donation to the museum, did the donor buy the painting for his or her collection because it was Spanish, or as a work by an old master painter held in high regard? Finally, with regard to either a purchase or a donation, either a donor or a purchase by a curator in the museum, was the choice of the Spanish artist related to his reputation among modern artists, which is obviously a pressing question for El Greco. With regard to the first question, whether the work was purchased as an example of Spanish or European art, this may seem like an odd way of thinking to some of the Europeans in the audience, but you must consider that 19th century America was a place where, firstly, and you're looking at the Met on 14th Street in the 1870s, and one of the galleries in that building in this painting by Frank Waller of 1881. In America, there was, at this time, no significant art museums before the 1870s. Secondly, they had very limited collections before the 20th century, and that English critic Roger Fry was so ungracious as to point that out immediately upon his arrival as curator in 1906. And in many ways, European culture represented in America culture, period. Thus, in 1801, to think a little earlier for a moment, the Society of Fine Arts in New York sent the American portraitist John Vanderlyn to Paris in order to obtain casts of antique sculpture and copies of old master paintings, specifically by Raphael, Correggio, Titian, Caravaggio, Poussin, Rubens, and Rembrandt. That was the list, to which he added a personal favorite, Potter, who I might not have thought of, but he was a greatest hit at the time. The Society's members were not mainly Italian. The list of 7 artists, 4 of them Italian, was composed with little or no thought given to the countries that they happened to come from, no proportional representation. Similarly, the Met's president, Henry Marquand, in the 1880s, assembled a collection of old master paintings precisely to give them all in the near future to the Metropolitan Museum to raise the quality and breadth of the collection. He himself collected mostly 19th century American art and some very recent European pictures. His 1889 gift to the museum, that one had 37 old masters in it, included our first Spanish pictures. On the left was a painting called, at the time, Zuberan, which we think of as Ignacio de Ries these days, and the portrait of a man which was a Velázquez at the time and is now considered a workshop picture. These were given along with his very recent purchases of paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, the first Vermeer in America, of course, the woman with the water pitcher, Frans Hals, Ruysdael, Terborch, Teniers, Van Dyck, Filippo Lippi, Turner, works attributed to Jan van Eyck and Lucas van Leyden, and quite a few other paintings, altogether a mixed bag of things that were lacking in America and that happened to be on the art market in the 1880s. I think the painting on the left would probably have not been the most welcome in the Marquand gift. 19th century America was very much a middle class and Protestant country with, and I think it's worth saying in respect to Spain, an active dislike of monarchy or even nobility, and the Catholic Church. This is touched upon in Richard Kagan's article in the Frick volume, Collecting Spanish Art, in 1912, but the prejudice went well beyond Spain. For example, Rubens was admired by some American artists of the 1800s, but a Rubens like this one, which is in the Met, the Holy Family with St. Francis, you could hardly give them away before 1900. This one was given to the Met shortly after it was purchased by its third owner in 1902 and then given to the Met in that year. It's the first Rubens in an American public collection, and one could say that it remains atypical of American taste. Alexis de Tocqueville touched on this question in 1835, noting that Americans have little use for any kind of abstraction, whether philosophical or religious. They have, quote, but little faith for whatever is extraordinary and an almost insurmountable distaste for whatever is supernatural, unquote, adding that American Catholics try to keep a low profile. They never referred to the saints. As for monarchy, Elbert Hubbard, in his moronic series of books called Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Painters of 1899, assures us that Rubens, who he describes as a courtly phrased animal, was so suave that he taught members of the Spanish court how to roll cigarettes while engaged in conversation. I think cigarettes were not that common, actually, in the time of Philip IV, but they were a factor in the tobacco worker's career. Carmen, Bizet's opera, debuted in Paris in 1875 and in New York in 1878. This is interesting for the Met's collection of Spanish paintings in 1905, and here it is, the entire collection of Spanish paintings, with the El Greco bought in that year, 1905. And that El Greco is a largely autograph, I think, version of the Adoration of the Shepherds, late works of about 1600 to 1605 on the left, and a bit later in the Met's version of that picture. Again, the Adoration on the left is in the museum in Valencia. So this El Greco is the first purchase of a Spanish painting of any kind in the Met, and is, I think, broadly related to the rising reputation of El Greco at this time, but probably not related directly to Cézanne and Picasso and so on, which I hope to explain. Like so many El Grecos on the market in the early 1900s, this painting does have a Paris connection. By 1904, it was owned by the dealer Seligman in Paris, who probably bought it at the 1903 London sale of a Scottish collector, who himself got it from his friend Kerr Larson, who was an unusual Englishman in the world of Spain. He wrote the catalog of paintings for the Prado Museum in 1896. Seligman sent this picture to his partner Glanzer in New York. Bernard Berenson offered it to Mrs. Gardner in Boston. When she said no, Berenson then persuaded the Metropolitan Museum, who was considering him as a director at the time, J.P. Morgan didn't like him, to buy this picture for $35,000, which was a colossal price for a rather average El Greco, 1.5 meters high at this date. Seligman paid about $7,500 for the painting, gave Berenson $8,000 for the connection he made, so the dealer made about $20,000 profit. Meanwhile, another Paris dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, whose name comes up constantly, of course, in El Greco, but better known for Impressionism, in Paris, could not afford to buy this picture in Madrid, the Assumption of the Virgin, which is a 13-feet-high painting in Chicago now, which is from El Greco's first important commission in Toledo, the retablo of Santo Domingo el Antiguo of the late 1570s. And what you see in the church today is not the Chicago painting or the Prado Trinity, but good copies of around 1900, and the other paintings by El Greco remaining on the retablo are by El Greco and his workshop. Durand-Ruel's great client, Louisine Havemeyer, felt strongly enough about the Assumption to advance him the money for it, and she would have kept it until she realized that it was 13 feet high and would not fit into her home. She only saw it from a photograph. So she offers it to the Met at cost, $17,000 in 1904. And boy, am I sorry that didn't happen. And she receives a letter from one of the Met's trustees, the art dealer Samuel Avery, saying that the museum had already secured a finer one, without mentioning that it had cost them twice as much, $35,000. And so here's the deal. And here is the Assumption, not in the Met, but in Chicago. In 1906, the painting went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and it was actually at the suggestion of Mrs. Havemeyer's advisor and close friend, Mary Cassatt, that it went to Chicago, and Chicago did not get the picture at cost for $17,000, but $40,000, probably based on the Met paying $35,000 for what was clearly a lesser work. After some delay, the Assumption was then paid for by Mrs. Havemeyer's friend, Nancy Atwood Sprague, in memory of her husband when he died in 1915. The Met could easily have bought both of these El Grecos. We had in 1905 the new $5 million acquisitions fund from a man named Rogers, who was a locomotive manufacturer. Here is a cable 51 weeks after we bought the Adoration of the Shepherds, cable of December 22nd, 1905, from our founder and trustee, Rutherford Stuyvesant, who actually lived in Paris, and he writes to the Met, "Chicago Museum impatient, Durand-Ruel can't delay, answer, what is Met's decision?" Met Museum's decision. So it would have been easy to have them both, acquisitions a year apart. And I think the main reason that we did not buy it in December is that the trustees simply would have been too embarrassed by the comparison of paying $35,000 for the lesser work, and a year later it would have brought up whoever on the Board of Trustees was for the acquisition in January 1905. Might have felt against this work for rather personal reasons, but we don't know that for a fact. In 1905, the Met's curator of paintings was the elderly and deservedly obscure, you've never heard of him, I think, George Story, who was succeeded in 1906 by the English art critic, painter, and teacher Roger Fry, whose self-portrait is on the left. He was hired by the man he learned to intensely dislike, and he disliked America in general. That's J.P. Morgan, then the Met's president, and therefore he became the Met's curator at large, wandering around Europe looking for things to buy until 1910, when Morgan finally got fed up and fired him. In 1906, Fry's interests turned almost exclusively to Cezanne and modern art, through which he came to admire El Greco, but without any consequences for the Met. In fact, very little happened in the Spanish area until the 1920s. J.P. Morgan was really not interested in anything Baroque and little interest in Spanish art. Many of the French and Italian and some German paintings were acquired between 1905 and 20, balancing out the largely Dutch pictures that came in earlier periods, especially the well-known 1871 purchase. In that same period, 1905 to 20, 3 Spanish paintings entered the museum, doubling that part of the collection. One was the purchase of the Goya on the left, and then 2 with the Altman bequest Velázquez paintings, Altman bequest of 1913. In the case of Benjamin Altman, the motivation was very much like Marquand's in the 1880s. Marquand, unlike Marquand, Altman had no official connection with the Metropolitan Museum, and for social reasons, he probably never would have become a Met trustee, let alone president. But the founder of the largest department store in America, B. Altman and Company, collected big names of European art precisely because his city's museum did not have them. And he told almost no one about this except 2 trustees of the Met that he swore to secrecy in 1905. So he gives the Met, at his unexpectedly early death in 1913, 13 Rembrandts, of which 6 really are by Rembrandt and 6 others are fine paintings. 3 Frans Hals, a great Vermeer, major works of Italian Renaissance and early Netherlandish pictures. These 2 Spanish paintings, although I have to say for Altman, Velázquez could just as well have been Polish, so long as he was an artist that was considered one of the great masters of European paintings. This changes a bit with our curator Bryson Burroughs, who is hired in 1906 as an assistant to Fry. He is a painter, age 37 at the time. This is one of his paintings of that period. Burroughs was the Met's main curator of European paintings until his death in 1934. He had very good taste, and he was rather historically minded for the period. And while he did not buy many Spanish paintings, he did purchase or encourage the donation of some strategic acquisitions in that area. He also acquired the Wolf and Fox Hunt and major works that he saw in London, Paris. He traveled quite a bit for acquisitions. An important consideration for him at this time was that the wealthy collector and scholar Archer Huntington, photo you've seen before but not in this context, founded the Hispanic Society in 1904, and then the museum opened in 1908. And of course, a consequence for the Met was that Archer's mother, Arabella Huntington, one of our great patrons, whose French and English and Dutch paintings were given to the Met at her death in 1905, largely left the collecting of Spanish pictures mainly to her son Archer. Of course, there were other great collectors in New York like Marquand and Altman, and the others thought mainly, firstly, in favor of the great names of Europe, but that included El Greco, Velázquez, Murillo, and Goya. Thoberan was much less appealing to these collectors of the Gilded Age. And I think partly as a result, when this begins to change in the 1920s, you get quite benign works by Thuberan, not mournful saints or martyrdoms, but the battle scene of Jerez de la Frontera, bought in 1920, and the young Virgin acquired in 1927. And these were purchases, which is interesting. There was hardly a Thuberan in a private collection that would have been given to the Met around that time. The two most famous El Grecos in the Metropolitan Museum, as you know, are Havemeyer pictures, left to the museum at the death of Louisine Havemeyer in 1929. Mrs. Havemeyer, in her memoirs, tells the story of how El Greco's portraits in the Prado, seen by the Havemeyers in 1901, such as these two, first inspired their interest in the artist. This is interesting because they're really quite naturalistic pictures. The Havemeyers are collecting Degas paintings, for example. They're collecting Manets, such as these two, both bought in 1863 from Durand-Ruel's New York branch. And here are two Havemeyer Goyas bought around the same time, works of about 1803, that their daughter gave to the National Gallery in Washington. These were first bought by Durand-Ruel from Durand-Ruel in 1897, the first of 4 Goyas and 11 alleged Goyas, which the Havemeyers rather hastily acquired in these years. This is before the Havemeyers go to Spain for the first time in the spring of 1901. And this fairly long and intrepid journey to Spain for about 2 months really deserves to be considered a study trip, as it was for a good number of Americans in this period. And if I can make a brief aside about this, partly for my European friends in the audience, here's the reality of going to Europe in the 19th century. And if you look at, it takes 16 weeks, for example, to get to France in about 1850. You might get it down, 16 days. 14 days in 1855 or so, and you can read the line for yourself. But imagine that you're someone in the 1860s. You're really committing 3 weeks just to the round trip by boat without the actual visit to Europe. So this is part of the distance of America from Europe. That must have been a serious factor for knowing these countries in the original and, of course, visiting places like Madrid. However, if you're wealthy, it's a little different. At the age of 19, Louisine Havemeyer spent 7 months in Paris with her mother and sisters in 1874. It was there that she met the 30-year-old American painter Mary Cassatt. On the left is a self-portrait of Mary Cassatt and her portrait of Louisine Havemeyer. And Mary Cassatt had lived in Paris and Rome already for 8 years at that time and had recently studied in Madrid and in Seville, copying pictures in the Prado, etc. In the next few years, Cassatt became a disciple of Degas, major impressionist figure, great friend and advisor to the Havemeyers, who got married in 1883. Henry, or as he was called, Harry Havemeyer, had a monopoly on sugar in America, made him a very wealthy man, had bought a fair number of old masters. This is his Rembrandt room in the 1890s in the Havemeyer mansion on Fifth Avenue, and one of the Rembrandts that he purchased in that period, and a photo of Harry to the upper right. When Harry looked out the window from this office on March 14th, 1888, I want you to remember this tomorrow, he saw 5 feet of snow. That was the blizzard of 1888, and it hasn't been matched since. So you'll only suffer through half of that. Harry Havemeyer had about 20 servants and 12 horses, which you would find useful tomorrow if you had those, but but we don't. The Havemeyers must have seen works by Cézanne, but they did not buy anything by him until 1904, and really nothing typical until 1906. They were, however, quite invested in artists such as Degas and Monet, and a variety of old masters and other modern paintings such as this Veronese and this Manet portrait of George Moore in the Metropolitan Museum. But I would say that, and this is a basic point, and I have to rush because I'm going to run about 5 minutes late, but a basic point would be that I would say, although they are broadly familiar with old masters and modern painting, that it was really their direct exposure to El Greco in the Prado, and then immediately after that in Toledo, seeing him in the churches and talking to Manuel Casillo, who they got to know immediately in Madrid, and making all of these personal connections, that they really principally admired El Greco in a historic Spanish context. So it's a bit of both. And, you know, you certainly don't want to say one or the other. Obviously, they were sensitized to be broad-minded and not scared away by El Greco's modern aspects as they were seen at the time, by their sophisticated world of collecting in Paris and friends like Mary Cassatt. But everything that you read in the letters of Cassatt or in other critics of the time tend to be a little later, 1903, 1905. There's a diplomat and collector, for example, named Royal Tyler, who's a great friend of Mildred Barnes Bliss, the co-founder of Dumbarton Oaks. And he writes to her in 1905 that people here in Paris are just beginning to wake up to El Greco in 1905. Now, it depends who you're connected with. If you're an old buddy of Degas or Durand Ruel, that might not be the case. But the Havemeyers are really moved towards El Greco, firstly by the portraits in the Prado in March of 1901. Mrs. Havemeyer says there's no big compositions, no great history works by him in the Prado, but some of his best portraits there. And Miss Cassatt and Mr. Havemeyer, which is the way she refers to her husband in her memoirs, would go back and back to the Prado. Always the fascination of that painter threw a spell on us. We could not resist his art, his intensity, its individuality, freedom, and its color attracted us with irresistible force. We determined to see every work of his in Spain, for we knew of few elsewhere. And within a few days, they'd bought photographs of works all over and met Casillo and went off to see the burial of Count Orgoth. Casillo had told them it was the greatest work El Greco ever did, and the Cardinal Nino de Guevara was the second greatest work he ever did, and it was going to be on the cover of his book, which was finally published. Indeed, he kept his promise. In 1908, the book was published, and by that time, in 1901, rather, began a three-year campaign to buy the Cardinal, which Durand Ruel finally secured from the owner in Madrid in 1904. They heard about the view of Toledo in 1901, saw photos, did not see it until after Mr. Havemeyer's death in 1907, and Mrs. Havemeyer finally bought the picture in 1909, writing later, probably in the 1920s, that it reminded her of the Havemeyers' first day in Toledo, just as we saw the city on that memorable afternoon. Actually, if you compare photos, that's an interesting memory. The city does look a little different than this. In the same passage, she recalls their difficulty in finding the Church of San Tomé. This is again 1901, and then standing alone finally in the chapel. It was a long, long time, she writes, before Mr. Havemeyer moved or spoke. Finally, he heaved a sort of sigh, as if expressing a thought to himself. Then turning to me, he said, so very softly that I realized how deeply he was stirred, "One of the greatest pictures I have ever seen. Yes, perhaps the greatest." And then on the way back to the hotel, he says, "Who is this artist? Where have we seen works before? That man makes me think, who knows anything about him?" So they weren't that much exposed earlier in Paris before this trip in Spain. And I really find this quite impressive that, these people who live in New York with dealers ringing their doorbell every 5 minutes with masterpieces to buy can go to Spain and really make it an integral part of learning about the culture and their travel. Here is the chapel, of course. They try to buy many El Grecos that slip through their fingers. These two that are now in the National Gallery of Art, picked up by Peter Widener in 1909. The Havemeyers tried for them in that year. Of course, they come from the Capilla de San Jose in Toledo. They're just out of the picture to either side, or were once upon a time. During Mrs. Havemeyer's trip to Spain in 1909, she tries to buy the original Saint Ildefonso. We saw two other versions of it acquired earlier in America, and this was just around the time that legislation was being passed in Spain, and I'd be curious to know what date it actually passed to prevent pictures from leaving the country. And it was Ricardo de Madrazo who was exploring the possibility of taking the picture off of this altarpiece on the left. And as someone who went there for the first time last year, I'm kind of glad Mrs. Havemeyer missed this one, and that's something of a rare emotion amongst Metropolitan Museum curators. It's often said that the Havemeyers brought Impressionism to America, and so they did. But the claim Mrs. Havemeyer makes in her memoirs, written in the 20s, is that we were, so to speak, to open the market for Grecos and Goyas, at least in the United States. They had their cardinal at home in 1904. Frick bought his, which is on the left, St. Jerome, and in the following year, 1905, Frick bought his from his new neighbor, quite deliberate neighbor, the dealer Nerdler. Philip Lehman bought his, which is on the right, in the Metropolitan Museum in 1912, not surprisingly, from Durand Ruel. The other two Frick El Grecos were purchased in 1909 and 1913. In her memoirs, Mrs. Havemeyer makes this crack about my old friend, H.C. Frick, who failed to ever get a great Goya portrait because he balked at the price of the first one, and then he failed to cable when he finally made up his mind about it, as I told him to do. Mr. Frick took his disappointment very amicably, but although he later bought two El Grecos, actually three, he never owned a really great Goya. I realized how fortunate it was that we had made a start in buying Spanish art on that April morning of 1901, even if our first purchase was only a small picture by Greco, which actually it wasn't, but that's okay. Finally, just remind you the other El Greco in the Lehman collection was bought by Robert Lehman, Philip's son, in 1953. The Old Man by El Greco, occasionally discussed as a self-portrait, was purchased through the curatorial efforts of Bryson Burroughs in 1904, arguing that the Met should have a good example of portraiture by El Greco. Of course, the Cardinal only came in with Mrs. Havemeyer's death in 1929. Burroughs went to Madrid to negotiate closely with the widow of the director of the Prado, Orellano de Berruete, after numerous letters, and they consulted various experts, including John Singer Sargent in the Copley Hotel, Boston, shortly before he died in 1924, who said he had seen it twice in his life, never forgot it. Do go ahead. In the end, Burroughs was authorized to close the deal for $25,000 in 1924, or $48,000 if the widow Berruete would throw in this drawing. Imagine how El Greco would have felt about this pairing if you know his history in Rome, and especially that he got slightly more money for his picture than the Met gave for the Michelangelo drawing of Sybil for the Sistine ceiling. The Reitzmans gave us this picture in 1978, our only Venetian or Italian period El Greco, and I have sent a letter to her, but I don't have an answer yet about what motivated them. And then finally, the Great Vision of John, 1956, purchased by our curator, Ted Russo, and that really was very much to do with modern art, but by 1956, that's a pretty well-established history. Russo had an irritating habit, according to director James Morimer, of hanging modern pictures next to old masters to make some kind of point. But to be fair to him, he wrote a great article in the Met Bulletin in 1959 explaining how it came from the 3 altars in the Tavera Hospital in Toledo, their later history, only the baptism in the middle ever delivered, 2 pictures cut down at later dates. And you realize that the subject is very different, in fact, than the Picasso subject, although Picasso didn't think so. This was called an allegory of profane love when Zuloaga bought it in Cordoba in 1905, took it right to his Paris studio, and Picasso sees it there. The stylistic connections are often made, but Picasso actually imagined that the El Greco was something like a nude disco scene with a disc jockey on the left, that it wasn't understood. It was said that the top part that had been cut off in 1880 was clearly divine love because there were angels in that part of the composition. I think this has to do with churches being 30 feet high and Madrid bedrooms or living rooms being only 10 feet high. So a number of pictures are cut down at this date, but it's fascinating to think that Zuloaga entertained this notion until his death in when is it? The 1950s. And then we promptly buy the picture after that. Sorry to take so long. Thank you very much.